as we seek to continue to create the beloved community amidst all of these different challenges. And we're about to shift, but before we make this shift, Natasha, I know you've been doing some important work with Habitat for Humanity as it relates to the beloved community. And I wanted you just to take a few moments to share about the intersectionality of affordable housing in this conversation around economic justice and creating the beloved community.
Absolutely. Thank you. And so great to be with you. We're continuing to expound upon the brilliant idea you had about 2018 in commemoration of the assassination of your father. We said, what are some of the legacies that are going to come out of this painful moment? And part of that was, how are we continuing to transform our communities? So as we continue that partnership with you in the Habitat Network, which is global, which reaches Asia Pacific region, Africa, Eastern Europe, the LAC region, which is our Latin American and Caribbean, throughout the United States, we realize that the world is in need of love. And one way we do bring that to the world is through our mission, which is to put God's love into action by building hope and communities together with communities all over the world. And one tangible way that we strive to put that love into action is through the provision and the building of affordable housing, decent shelter, providing also through that the opportunity for home ownership for populations that typically would otherwise be denied that amazing opportunity, not just to build brick and mortar homes, but to transform community, to provide a home for their family, their children to thrive. That intersects then obviously with educational attainment, with better health outcomes, and with the opportunity to build wealth. We know that one of the biggest issues and gaps remains that wealth gap in this country, in this city, in this world. So one way to begin bridging that gap is through home ownership, through creating that. So we are partnered with you all in building the beloved community, literally, conceptually, and transformationally. So it's truly a joy and an honor to work in that regard and to continue to push that throughout the network. And so the work that we're doing specifically with the role that I play as a global DE&I officer, diversity, equity, and inclusion officer, is to really propel that intentionally, purposefully, with the intention of transforming mindsets, behaviors, and communities. So it's been exciting, and there's so much more to do.
Oh yeah, there's a lot to do. But we thank God for everything that has been done and that people are doing now, that you're doing with Habitat for Humanity. And the word global, I want to focus on that word for a minute, because as we go into this next discussion, it's really about also creating global mindsets. We've got to continue to challenge those biases that we all have that causes us to create the divisions that we have in our world, that create a number of these problems and challenges and injustices that we are experiencing. And as a result, when we don't have that kind of mindset, hate, can be seeded in us. And then that seed ends up birthing a harvest. And so this next part of our conversation is going to talk about be, love, transform, hate. And I just want to share a few things that I happen to do a bit of research on, and just for the sake of everybody listening, because we make a lot of assumptions in our world that everybody, understands exactly what we're saying when we talk about hate crime. So now the FBI has defined a hate crime as a criminal offense against a person or property motivated in whole or in part by an offender's bias. That's why we got to deal with the biases and understand how we intersect with one another in this world. So by an offender's bias against a race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity. Hate itself, however, is not a crime. I wanted to say that hate itself is not a crime. We have the protection of freedom of speech. But when that hate rises to the level of action, then we move it into the level of a crime. But we want to get to a place in our world where people do not even entertain hate. They don't have hate in their heart. And that's a lot of heart work that we do as well. Here's another thing. There's been a rise in hate crimes. It reached its highest level in more than a decade. President Biden, as many of us know, signed recently a bipartisan piece of legislation that addresses the rise in anti-Asian hatred, where there have been attacks against our Asian, Asian Pacific and Pacific Islander brothers and sisters as a result of false narratives and rhetoric surrounding the origin of COVID-19. It's estimated that more than 200,000 people are victims of hate crimes. But this is where I want to make a little bit of a distinction here, because people are talking about the rise in hate groups. There's really not a rise in hate groups. According to an annual count by the Southern Poverty Law Center, active hate groups have declined, but there has been no decline in hate and extremism. I want you to hear that. The groups have declined, but hate and extremism has risen, and hate crimes have risen. And part of this challenge is that we have social media. So many extremists, many ideologues are not formal members of any organization, but these online platforms allow them to engage and connect with hate and anti-government groups without joining them. So that's a big issue and a big hurdle that we have to address. And we have some people joining us today, and I'm excited about it, who are going to help us in this conversation about Be Love, Transform Hate. I had wonderful conversation with one of our guests, and actually I had a wonderful conversation with all of our guests. But I especially had this conversation with Jeannie Mai. Many of us know her, Emmy Award-winning TV personality and advocate against human trafficking. I don't know if I should say this, but she's married to Jeezy. What is the show?
Newlywed. So I'm sure she wants you to share that.
She is a newlywed. And what's the name of the show? Why am I forgetting it?
With The Real.
The Real. I shouldn't forget that.
That's why we tag team.
Yeah, exactly. So Jeannie Mai is with us today, is going to join us in this discussion, and she has a group that she's a part of called the Avengers. And hopefully we also have Daniel Day Kim, has made a career creating multifaceted and stereotype breaking roles as an actor, director, and now producer. What's the name of the show? You got a tag team with me on that. Hawaii 5-0.
Hawaii 5-0, that's right.
Daniel Day Kim.
Yes. I saw them filming one time on vacation. That was very cool.
Yes. Not the Hawaii 5-0 when I was a kid.
Right, it's very different.
New Hawaii, the remake. And then a gentleman that I had the pleasure of conversing with the other night as a part of our Beloved Community Talks when we were dealing with unlearning. Yes, these biases, racism, so much stuff. Christian Picciolini, we know that he ended up becoming a part of a hate group, neo-Nazi hate group, but came out of it and has an incredible story about how he broke free from all of that, and now has authored a book called Breaking Hate, and he's a founder of Free Radicals Project. So let's welcome now Jeannie Mai, Daniel Day Kim, and Christian Picciolini.
Hi, ladies.
Hey.
Hello.
Oh, I see y'all got it. I see you got your shirt. Yeah. Now we got to make sure. Christian, that's good, Christian. Natasha, you got love somewhere around.
There's my love.
There's your love.
In Korea, we do it this way too.
Oh, I like that.
I'm gonna have to look at that again. So this is Be Love Day. We're gonna make sure that Natasha and Christian get their shirts as well, their gear. And I'm just so happy to have you all with us to deal with this very troubling part of our time, which is all of the rising hate in our society and world. My father, we all know, said, returning hate for hate only multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. And that wonderful thing I said early on when we first started, that darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that, and hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And he went on to say, that's why I decided to stick with love, because hate is too great a burden to bear. And I think we all know that. I can say personally, I know it because I went through a season in my life because of all of the loss in our family. My father being assassinated at 5, my uncle, who was an avid swimmer, found in his swimming pool with no water in his lungs, mysteriously died. My grandmother being shot in church when I was 11 years of age. And so, a lot of anger began to well up inside of me, bitterness, just a lot of emotions, and eventually got to a place where I started hating all white people. And especially white males. And I had to address that issue because it was eroding things inside of me. And I knew ultimately that I would not be an effective vessel if I continued down that pathway, and what I was feeling was going to control the rest of my life. So let's talk about this, because each of you are actively utilizing your platforms to address injustice and bridge the divides in our world. And when you see an increase in the growing number of hate crimes, how do you think we need to use love to interrupt the indoctrination of people, and especially our young people, into these hate networks? And anybody can jump in.
Well, first off, thank you. Oh,
please.
Well, I just want to thank you, ladies, so much for having us here. This day, I was looking forward to it ever since I saw you posting it, Dr. Bernice. We need this. I wish it could be every day that we're remembering how to act in love and to move in love, because we all know love isn't a feeling, it's an action. And I'm so thankful that you're even, touching on the topic of what we've seen just with Asian hate crimes. And then you going through a history of knowing too well, too close, how this has been happening to your community and even too close in your family. Love is, it's such a big thing to talk about, but it's so hard. It feels so easy to have it. Like everybody wants it. Everybody wants to look for love in life. Like everybody hopes to find that one person they can fall in love with, or to bear children in it and feel that love. But it's so strange that that same feeling we yearn for, that is just as easy to build towards other people, that we don't automatically have. And slowly it feels like we're becoming this world that is more guarded in love. It feels like somebody has to earn love before you give it. More and more I hear, people like, you can't go out in the street anymore. You used to be able to keep your doors unlocked. And for me, I really think it's an individual effort to believe in the type of world that you want to live in, and just to start to show that. How many times have we remembered when somebody just showed us a selfless act of love, something that was just caring or thoughtful, even just greeting you, checking how your day is, a stranger saying that, a compliment, letting conversations go beyond how are you doing and just a brisk okay, and that's it, but really checking in. I've become much more intentional about my conversations with people, and even with strangers. As we're slowly, coming outside, I'm making eye contact. I feel like quarantine gave me a second to recognize how important he is and how important people are, and to just now, when I move outside, to be that love that I expect to see in return. And I'm actually seeing it. That's the crazy thing. I'm actually seeing a different response towards people, as they're a little shocked that I'm, a warmer, outgoing, friendlier person, because I'm not normally. I'm a little bit more reserved, So that's a start to begin with, because we need to first feel that as a community, and then we start to need to take action towards these harsher things that are happening in our own circles.
It's like being the love you want to see.
Yes,
right?
Like making it happen. Yes, showing myself that I can do it by extending myself more with people, and being more thoughtful about the questions I ask, and checking in and actually waiting intently to listen to more than just people think that they just have to tell me. Being there.
So Christian, you have a background in being a part of, these networks and groups where hate was just like at the core. Talk to us about that, and how, you have found yourself to this other space now of being able to operate out of a love, and the power of that love to transform and even help to bring others, out of it.
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. King. It's a real privilege to be here, given that past. To the point that you made, where you were able to self-examine yourself, and based on what other people had physically done to you, to examine your own hatred of them is remarkable. Me, I was 14 years old, and I was involved from the time I was 14 until I was 23, about 30 years ago. My hatred for other people wasn't based on anything that they had actually done to me. I had never had any bad experience with people of color, or with Jewish people, or people who were gay, or people who were Asian, or anything. I'd really never had very much exposure to them at all. I think I said last time we talked, hatred is born of ignorance, fear is its father, and isolation is its mother. And for me, that was exactly what it was. I felt both afraid and isolated, afraid of what I didn't understand, and isolated from it in order to understand it. My parents are Italian immigrants. I am the son of immigrants. For all intents and purposes, I should have understood that experience, but instead I felt so isolated that I started to blame other people for what pain I felt. I was projecting my own self-hatred, I guess, on other people, so to speak, because I was too afraid to deal with it. And it wasn't until, I started to get older and understand what I was doing, and the impact of what I was doing, that I saw a way out. But even then, when I saw a way out, it wasn't easy to leave, because I had built my whole world for those 8 years that I was involved in that movement, in that hate movement, where I found identity, community, and purpose in very toxic ways, but it was the only identity, community, and purpose I'd found. And luckily, I found some people who were willing to take a chance on me, and it was people of color who saw in me when, they didn't have to do that. They didn't have to be the ones who were compassionate to the hater, but I'm so lucky that they were, because it allowed me the space to really, one, reflect on why I hated and who I actually hated, and two, understand that I actually had more in common with the people I thought I hated than the people I had surrounded myself with. Unfortunately, so much of that was driven by my uncertainty. And I think that what we're dealing with in society today is so much uncertainty, pandemic on top of job loss, on top of people dying, on top of all sorts of things we don't really understand, with very poor leadership, for the last, 4 years or so. On top of that, we are in kind of a pressure cooker of this occurring again. And I see, a lot of really hard work ahead of us, continued work, in so many spaces to kind of overcome this again.
Wow. And Christian, you just expressed the embodiment of what it looks like for love to drive out hate. Because you said that you began to shift because of the compassion of the people you hated. Yeah. That's such a powerful statement.
By people I didn't deserve it from, at a time I didn't deserve it. It was the most powerful tool, Reverend, right? Wow. So it was really remarkable.
And the other thing you pointed out was isolation. I'm sorry, Dr. King.
Go ahead.
Yeah, because you pointed out isolation, and I was thinking about your comment and Jeannie's comment. So Daniel, we're getting ready to come to you. Your comment and Jeannie's comment about, this moment of pandemic that we just had. It was very isolating. So now as we start to re-enter, I don't want to get back to normal, because normal is what led us into so many of the pre-existing conditions, right? How do we re-enter with this focus on a love that interrupts hate, on really touching those who've been so isolated and hoping to compassionately pull them back in to community? Daniel, what do you think?
Well, it's a great question, and it's one that I think embodies the spirit of everything that we're talking about right now, because it's not something, love is not the default necessarily of who we are. It's very easy for all of us to regress into our own tribes, into the people that we know, and to make our world smaller at times of crisis, like a pandemic, and surround yourselves with the people that you think you can trust, and everyone else then is considered an outsider. And once we start having that kind of tribal mentality, then it's easy to have an us versus them mentality, when really progress is about exactly what Dr. King, your father, was talking about, a beloved community where everyone accepts one another, not based on the color of their skin, but the content of their character. And this is a constant, it's a habit. And love, I think the misconception is that love is just a happy state of bliss where you don't think about anything. I can tell you, as a person who's been married for over 20 years, love is hard work. you know, and everyone wants to be loved, but to give love is an act of effort and faith. And, you know, I'm sorry to quote your father so many times, but your father said, Dr. King, human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
Every step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering,
Yes.
and struggle. That's what it takes. It takes the tireless exertions of and passionate concern of dedicated individuals. And Dr. King and Natasha, you guys have paved the way for that. I'm honored to be a part of the conversation, and I'm honored to be a part of what I see as progress to the very thing that we're trying to fight against. And so it's a daily practice to not just preaching to the choir, but to reaching out to people that you don't normally interact with. As Jeannie was so rightly saying, you know, how do we expand our community as opposed to think about ways of limiting it?
Mm.
And so with that in mind, Christian, I want to ask you, because I'm sure there's some parents on here now that are listening in, and parent, even if they're not listening in this moment, because this will live, you know, on Facebook, they may be listening later. What can parents do, number one, obviously, to be either proactive or look for those things to ensure that their children are not being recruited or indoctrinated by hate groups or people that are tied into these hate networks?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. And for one, be sure that your children are interacting with this at some level. They're seeing it, it's coming across them in social media. Their friends are, you know, part of this in some way. It, unfortunately, because of the internet, has made it so, you know, you don't have to go to a dark alley to be confronted with it like I was in 1987 at 14 years old. The internet comes into our bedrooms, into our living rooms, into our, you know, hands and our phones. So there is a very concerted effort by extremists to utilize technology to get to places where vulnerable people are. What I would say first is, you know, it's the same thing we've been taught for, you know, generations about, you know, if your kids are into drugs or in a gang, their habits change. They're, you know, they drop all the things that they normally found some joy in or found some love in, and they shift to something else. They either, you know, lose friends that they've had or gain new friends that, you know, kind of are against their character. But I think it's also important as parents that we talk to our children, but more importantly, we listen. And, you know, listening doesn't always happen with our ears. We have to pay attention to the things that they do, they say. We have to see, and we have to see them for who they are. I think as parents, as adults, it would be really incumbent on us to be more vulnerable with our children about ourselves. Because if we teach them that we can be vulnerable, they can then also learn to be vulnerable with us. Because they see us as superheroes. Either they like it or they don't, but they still see us as these kind of perfect, you know, beings that they have to live up to. And I think that if we show them that we're not perfect, and none of us certainly are, that they'll be okay with sharing some of their concerns about how to grow up and how to live life. But I also will say it isn't just about young people, Dr. King. Unfortunately, we're living in a world where on January 6th, there were no teenagers storming the Capitol before adults. So this, you know, and also to your point earlier, where it's we see hate crimes go up, but we see hate group membership go down, and that is because it has infected the mainstream. It is now okay in parts of the mainstream to mimic some of the things that I used to say when I was, you know, a neo-Nazi, a white supremacist, and that is not okay. That is something that we must change because until we do, and that has a lot to do with systemic and institutional racism breeding that sort of I'm okay with, you know, being complicit with racism and white supremacy. We have to change that if we ever want to measure progress again.
And so how are you doing that? How are you interrupting that kind of behavior?
Well, I try in any way I can. One is by talking about my experience having been involved in that. I know I reach a lot of people who are in these hate movements through my own story so that they know it is possible to change, because I guarantee you that at every moment in one person's life while they're in a hate movement, even those people question what they're involved in. It's kind of a dark world with not a whole lot of reward. So at some point, everybody questions, and if they see a way out, that's part of it. I also, you know, like so many of the videos that you played at the beginning, I'm trying to change the spaces around me, closest to me, to empower people of color who haven't been empowered in the past in any ways that I can, to shine a light on injustices. And what I'm doing specifically recently is talking about what so many people like me, that look like me, don't understand is the racist origins of American history. So I'm trying to shed a little bit of truth on those stories about, where the roots of American law enforcement were in things like slave patrols, and talk about codes in any way I can to inform people like me that, we have to question our history. If we ever want to measure progress, we have to understand who we were and who we are.
Powerful. And as we thank you for that work that you're doing, right? Because it's getting that narrative corrected, and how we talk about who we are as a country, who we are as a community. Also, it holds folks accountable. Like, ignorance is not an excuse for violence. Yeah. And we see that play itself out so often. And we've seen it with COVID. Yeah. The ignorance that has played out and led to so much violence, especially even against the Asian American community in the United States. Yeah.
And I'll also say that redemption without accountability is just another form of privilege. And I work with my group now to help people disengage from hate groups. So I've helped hundreds of people disengage. Wow. But one of the important things is I have to hold them accountable. They don't get a free pass. They don't just get to say, I'm sorry for what I've done. Right. They have to repair the damage that they've caused me. That's part of the process.
Wow. That's great. So Jeannie and Daniel, talk to us about the Asian American Foundation, the work that you all are doing there to address the increasing hate crimes.
Well, as part of the kind of practice of what we are doing every day and how we are trying to affect change, I like that you put on the hat there, Christian. Good look. There are a whole number of Asian Americans who have come together in a way that we never have before. People like to think of us as the silent minority, the ones that never speak up for ourselves. But the truth is, we have been speaking up for ourselves. It's just that people haven't been listening. And so now, in the wake of this pandemic, there's been an organization that has kind of come together in a really centralized national way, with significant funds behind it to try and promote this idea of unity, to try and promote this idea of equality, to fight injustice, all of the things that I think Dr. King, this organization, and the King Center are aligned with. And so Asian Americans are wanting to add our voices to that cause and be a part of the fabric of this fight to end inequity and injustice. And so I'm really proud to be associated with it, and Jeannie's been helping out along with a number of other Asian Americans who are passionate about this cause. And some of the things we're trying to do is change the narrative about race relations, American history, as Christian was referring to include our stories and people of color as part of the narrative of American history. I think it's incredibly important. And we're also trying to fight actively against the rise in Asian hate crimes and hate crimes against marginalized groups in general. And so, one of the things that I'm proudest of in terms regarding the Asian American Foundation is that it is by Asians, but not just for Asian Americans. It's all communities of color that we're trying to help by reaching out and providing funding for community organizations on a national level, but in a local way. So targeting groups all around the country to see if they can make a difference, because we all have to recognize that the community organizations in every locality are the ones that have been on the ground for decades doing the work and knowing the people who live around them. And we need to acknowledge and empower them to continue the great work they're doing.
That's awesome. Can you, as we're coming against ignorance, right? As we're trying to interrupt hate, we're also interrupting ignorance. What do you mean when you say the Asian American community? Can you tell us some about the diversity of the Asian American?
Jeannie, would you like to take that?
That's a great question.
That question. Well, I guess specific. If you were to give it a politically correct name, it would be the AAPI community, which is the Asian American Pacific Islander community. When you say who are they, you're right. The diaspora of the Asian network is crazy. Even myself, I have, through this, as Daniel said, since, you know, the rise of Asian hate crimes, I've reached out to so many different Asian American individuals that I never thought or knew would be considered like my brother or sister, because I come from the Bay, so I'm just used to Filipino, Chinese, Vietnamese, and I got my Black and my Hispanics, and like there it is, there's my world, you know. But then lately, I actually made it a thing for our household. We started to go out to celebrate other Asian American, Asian Pacific Islander cultures and foods. We've been going to Hmong restaurants. We've been trying Tibetan restaurants.
Yeah.
We've been trying, obviously, Hawaiian, Italian, like, I mean, really just going out there because, you know, as you all know, soon we're going to be so interlaced and intermixed. It's already happening. But you're right. People just see the majority of us as Chinese. Let's just pick the number one, you know, the largest country with the largest population, and we all just see us as that. And that's why a lot of these attacks are happening on anybody that looks Asian. A lot of these attacks happen because they're being called out because they just happen to think that they're Chinese and being associated with the COVID virus and all these things. So the one thing I think Daniel and I, we recently learned, there was this survey taken across America of, you know, who do you know that's famous, that it's Asian? And I think there was like 3 names on that. And one of them was like Bruce Lee and Lucy Liu, you know, just again, media being responsible for really portraying who are Asian Americans and what is the Pacific Islander, like what does that mean?
And South Asian, right? That's such a large population in the Atlanta area in particular.
That's a great point. To give a little context to what Jeannie's saying, first of all, the number one answer in that survey by a landslide of name a famous Asian was I don't know. 42% of the people could not name a single one. Bruce Lee came in at 11%. Yeah. So there's a big difference between 42 and 11%. Yeah. But, you know, in terms of the numbers, Asian America consists of 40 different countries and over 100 different languages. And so when we talk about Asian America, we're talking about the majority of the world's population, to be honest. So, you know, to be clumped into one group, you can see how it can have, you know, create difficulties and why something like data disaggregation is so important, because it's very easy to look at some of the most successful of us and say, oh, well, Asian Americans are doing fine. But if you knew that the Hmong community, the Burmese community, the Sri Lankan community had poverty rates at, in some cases, double the national average, you might not think that way. And so we cover the entire spectrum of socioeconomic diversity within one racial demographic. And so that's why it's so important to not think of us as a monolith. But at the same time, as Jeannie so correctly pointed out, the people who are attacking us don't really care whether you're Vietnamese or Sri Lankan or Lao or Korean. If you look vaguely Asian, that's the criteria they have for taking out their hate and their fear.
Wow, this has been just so rich, and I want to close out, and we have a few minutes, and give each one of you an opportunity to answer this question, because we've been asking each one of our guests, what are the practical applications that you can share in terms of how we can become stronger allies in the work of interrupting hate crimes through the power of love?
I'll go first. You know, I think hate crimes are something that most people don't understand, and I think even law enforcement in many ways doesn't understand it. So, you know, to the law enforcement community, I would say we need to look at exactly what hate crimes are, because so many are not being charged as they should be. There should be more hate crimes actually than are being reported. To people in general, what can we do in our practical lives? I think we have to start at our, you know, within our circles, within our you know, our families and our friends, to listen, to educate, to speak out when we see it, and to not be quiet about it. This is not a time to be quiet, because being quiet just, or finding the middle, you know, in some cases, is just sliding towards complicity. We can't do that anymore. People are getting hurt. And, you know, people have always been hurt, but we are now starting to see, you know, this happening on a mass scale. And I think that we have to be honest with ourselves. How are we complicit ourselves in this, in some way? And that self-reflection, I think, is really surprising, but it's so necessary for us to do, even if it is painful, because if we ever hope to move beyond this, we have to start with ourselves.
Awesome.
I agree with you, Christian. I would say I've really learned that love has to sometimes be uncomfortable. And we as people have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. It was a very uncomfortable year in 2020, but really for who? For the people who really just wanted to think that racism didn't exist in the world and that our Black communities still today weren't suffering from being oppressed and having to live under regulations and laws that were so outdated and so unfairly set for them, their families, their future. And it was an awakening for me. I knew racism existed, but I didn't know to that extent. And once I saw my community hit next, I'm thinking, who's next? Because as it's not just going to be the Black community, the Asian community, every group who was less superior or less important or less favored or less prioritized, we all will end up in that same boat. And so for me, getting uncomfortable with being uncomfortable means actually checking in with people and talking about this. Having these talks with my family has been very uncomfortable. And you know, the Asian community is very proud and very focused on work, and talking about things like racism and talking about racism amongst other races is very new. In my household, we've had some conversations that were breakthroughs because you saw the difference in the older generation and the younger generation, you know, teaching things that we had to talk about that was happening outside of our very own home, but also to appreciate how we got here. You know, how much certain minority groups and so much of the Black community has fought in order to get us the ability to get us to where we are today, with specifically Frederick Douglass and what he did with our immigration, the Chinese Immigration Act that took place. So I just really am appreciative of being more bolder now. I feel like conversations where I was like, oh my God, you don't talk about that at the dinner table. I'm not afraid anymore, but I talk about it in love. I'm not trying to check somebody. I'm not trying to act like I know more. And I want to listen, actually. Listening more so to what my family knows or doesn't know has helped me educate myself and embrace everybody to be able to talk about it so we all can learn collectively together.
That's good.
Yeah, I think the points that both Christian and Jeannie made were right on. You know, I think it is about taking our own sphere of influence, our circle of friends, and talking to them, and then trying to expand that sphere of influence to try and make change for the better. Because, you know, Dr. King, your father said, I don't know how many times, you know, that silence is complicity. Silence equals, you know, that people of, you know, people who might have a clear conscience but are silent are part of the problem. You know, these are all really important concepts. And the fact is, Jeannie's 100% right. It's tough. You know, this is not going to be easy. You know, we all know that between the Asian American community and the African American community, historically, there have been problems. And so we have to acknowledge those issues. We have to speak about them. We have to open them up, get inside of them so that we can move forward. We can't brush them under the table and pretend they never existed. And I really do think that, you know, there are a number of people in all of our communities that we will not be able to reach. I really do believe that. But I also believe that there are more of us that are open to this conversation, who do want to seek intersectionality and unity and harmony from all different races and creeds. And it's the people who are watching this stream right now who are going to be interested in that. And so for all of us here to empower each other to say, we are working together to solve this issue. And it's why I was so honored to be a part of this, because the fact that Dr. King, you reached out and wanted to include us as a group, you know, where traditionally that might not have happened. And we, you know, I can speak for Jeannie here that we've been looking for ways to show our support and be supportive of other communities of color, because I do believe we are all part of the same fabric of humanity. And, you know, another guest really early on quoted your father by saying, you know, we may have all come in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. And I 100% believe that. And that boat is America. And so, you know, I think we all have a vested interest in trying to make this place where we call home and our country a better place to live.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Appreciate that. Thank you, Jeannie, for your contributions, and Christian, we really appreciate each of you. And yes, we're part of this boat called America, but I want to expand it and say we're part of what my father called the World House. And we will be a part of that generation that helps us to learn how to live together as brothers and sisters, because we will not be forced to perish together as fools.
That's
So
right.
thank you all so much. We appreciate you sharing with us in terms of how love can transform hate, because as Daddy said, hate is too great a burden to bear, and we're going to rid this earth of hate through love.